Have you ever felt like there's a part of you don't really understand? Like, you're not sure who you really are anymore? I've been there too. Let me share something with you. Maybe it'll help you see things a little clearer. There are days when the world just feels too loud. Not in the way of traffic or noise, but in that constant pull. Messages flying at you, expectations tightening around your chest like invisible cords. Everyone's got something to say, some perfect version of life to sell. And if you're not keeping up, it feels like you're falling behind. I don't think I ever realized how much that noise was getting to me until I caught myself staring blankly at my phone screen one night, scrolling through people's highlight reels with this dull ache in my chest. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't even comparison in the usual sense. It was something emptier than that. Like I'd forgotten what my own life was supposed to feel like. I think that's the thing we don't talk about enough. That deep inner emptiness so many of us carry. Not because we have nothing, but because we've lost connection with something real inside ourselves. And instead of slowing down to figure out what that is, we just keep reaching outward, hoping something, anything, will fill the space. Social media, news, shopping, busy schedules, even relationships sometimes. They're all ways we try to distract ourselves from the silence we're afraid to sit with. What hit me hardest was realizing that the anxiety I'd been living with for years wasn't just about deadlines or future plans or even the state of the world. It was coming from a deeper place, this gnawing sense that I was moving through life on autopilot, smiling when I didn't want to, saying yes when I meant no, choosing paths not because they lit something up inside me, but because they were expected, safe, impressive, acceptable. And slowly, that disconnect grew. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. Just a subtle erosion, like a tide pulling away parts of me I didn't even realize were missing until I stood in front of the mirror one day and thought, who is this person? That question shook me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, and just breathing. For once, not trying to figure it all out, just letting the weight of that question sink in. And something cracked open, not in a painful way, more like the way light filters through blinds in the early morning. Gentle, but undeniable. I started to notice the moments I felt most anxious were also the moments I felt most distant from myself. It wasn't just about external stress. It was about internal dishonesty, about pretending I was okay with things that I wasn't, about performing a version of me that I thought people wanted while quietly burying the parts that didn't fit the image. Carl Jung once said that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, and I get that now. Because once you realize how far you've drifted from yourself, you're faced with a choice. Either keep drifting and hope the numbness protects you, or start turning back, even if the way is unclear. That turning point didn't come with fireworks. There was no epiphany, no sudden clarity. It was more like a quiet whisper that said, "This isn't it. This isn't who you are." And that whisper was enough to start walking in a different direction, slowly, shakily, but with a sense of something honest guiding me. The thing is, it's easy to mistake the world's chaos for the cause of our anxiety. And sure, the world can be overwhelming. But the most suffocating noise often comes from within, from the voice that tells you to keep it together, to keep up, to be who you think you should be, even when it's breaking you inside. I'm not saying I have it all figured out. I still get caught in the noise. I still feel that emptiness creep in sometimes, especially when I ignore what I need or silence my own voice to keep the peace. But I've learned to pause, to ask, is this really me? And more often than not, that question brings me back to something real. It's not always comfortable. In fact, it's often painful, realizing how many choices I made just to be liked, or to avoid conflict, or to fit a mold that was never mine. But pain can be honest. It tells the truth even when we don't want to hear it. And if we're willing to listen, it can guide us home. So if you felt that emptiness, that strange, unshakable feeling that something's off even when everything looks fine, I want you to know you're not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken. You're just waking up. And yeah, it's scary. But it's also the beginning of something real, something that no algorithm, no achievement, no mask can give you. It's the beginning of returning to yourself. I'll tell you what happened next in a moment. But for now, just breathe. You made it this far, and that means something. It's strange how subtle the lies can be. Not the ones we tell others, but the ones we whisper to ourselves just to get through the day. I used to think I was being strong by pushing through things that didn't feel right, by staying quiet when something bothered me, by smiling when I felt like screaming. It took me a long time to realize that wasn't strength. That was silence. That was erasure. And that erasure was feeding my anxiety more than any external pressure ever could. It wasn't always obvious. I mean, how do you know you're living a life that doesn't belong to you when you've spent so long convincing yourself that it does? That job I thought I wanted, the one that looked impressive on paper and made my parents proud, I didn't hate it, but it drained me in ways I couldn't explain. Every Sunday night came with a quiet panic. Tightness in my chest I chalked up to just stress. But it wasn't just stress. It was resistance. My soul resisting a life it hadn't chosen. I remember a conversation I had with a friend over coffee. We were both laughing about how tired we were, how we were functioning adults who were low-key falling apart. She joked, "At least you've got your life together." And I smiled, but inside I thought, if only you knew. That's what a lot of us do, right? We perform togetherness. We decorate our discomfort so no one has to see the cracks. But I've learned that anxiety loves those cracks. It seeps in through every little fracture between who we are and who we pretend to be. And it multiplies in the silence. There's something deeply unsettling about living in opposition to your inner truth. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it's just a dull ache, like something inside you is being slowly pressed down day after day until you can't remember what it was like to breathe deeply without that weight on your chest. Jung talked about this dissonance, this gap between our inner essence and our outer choices, as one of the core causes of neurosis. And I see that now, not as theory, but as lived experience. Because every time I ignored my gut, every time I said yes when my body screamed no, every time I dismissed a quiet longing for something different, I was building that dissonance. Brick by brick. Eventually, the anxiety wasn't just emotional. It became physical. My body started keeping score. Insomnia, random chest tightness, that ever-present buzzing under my skin that no amount of yoga or green tea could touch. I tried coping mechanisms, some healthy, some less so, but nothing really worked because I was trying to soothe symptoms without addressing the source. And the source was me, not in a self-blame kind of way, but in a self-honesty kind of way. It was the realization that I had built parts of my life on expectations that weren't mine, that I had ignored my own voice so many times it had gone quiet. And that's what really shook me. Not that I was anxious, but that I didn't know how to trust myself anymore. That's when the real work began. It started small. I began asking myself uncomfortable questions. Whose dream is this? Would I choose this if no one were watching? What would I be doing if I weren't afraid of disappointing anyone? Some answers came quickly. Others, well, I'm still figuring them out. But even asking was a breakthrough, because those questions cracked the surface of the script I'd been reciting for years. And beneath that script, there was something raw, something unfinished, but something mine. It's wild how terrifying it can feel to walk away from a life that looks good on the outside, but feels hollow inside. There's this guilt, this voice that says, you should be grateful. And I am. But gratitude doesn't mean you stop growing. It doesn't mean you betray yourself to preserve appearances. The hardest part was accepting that I didn't need a dramatic reason to change. I didn't need to crash and burn to justify wanting something different. Sometimes, the quiet realization that this isn't right for me is enough. I started saying no more, and not just to others, but to my own old patterns. I stopped forcing myself to be okay with things that didn't sit right. I gave myself permission to want more, not more in the sense of achievement, but more alignment, more truth, more peace. And slowly, painfully but surely, the anxiety began to shift. Not disappear, but shift. It was still there, but it felt different. Less like a monster under the bed, and more like a message waiting to be heard. A guide, a compass pointing not to danger, but to disconnection. That's when I really began to understand what Jung meant when he said that anxiety could be a gift. A hard one, yes, but a gift all the same. Because once you stop running from it, once you sit with it and ask what it wants you to know, it starts to speak in a new language, a language of realignment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was listening. You know, people often ask how you beat anxiety, like it's some enemy to be conquered. But that's never how it felt to me. It wasn't a battle. It was a relationship. Complicated, sometimes toxic, but never pointless. And once I stopped trying to silence it and started listening, it changed everything. I remember the exact moment the shift began. It was one of those mornings where everything was fine on the surface. Coffee brewed, emails sent, the usual rhythm of adult life. But inside, I felt hollow, like I was just moving through someone else's choreography. The dissonance had become unbearable. Instead of distracting myself or pushing through, I did something different. I sat down, closed my laptop, and asked out loud, "What are you trying to tell me?" It felt strange at first, talking to something invisible, like I was making up a character. But the stillness that followed was unlike anything I'd felt in months. It was as if, finally, the part of me that had been screaming into a void was given a seat at the table. And what it said, or what I began to understand, was that my anxiety wasn't a flaw. It was a signal, a message, a compass pointing back to where I'd gone off course. Jung said that symptoms are a voice of the soul, trying to be heard when we're not paying attention. And for the first time, I could see how my own symptoms, the restlessness, the tight chest, the irrational fears, were less about the world being unsafe and more about me living unsafely within myself. That hit hard. I started reflecting on all the moments I'd chosen comfort over truth, stability over growth, approval over authenticity. I saw how those choices weren't just moments, they were patterns. And patterns, when repeated long enough, become cages. But here's the thing. Once you see the bars, you can't unsee them. So I began tracing the thread of my anxiety. Not just where it hurt, but where it led. And what I found at the root wasn't madness or dysfunction. It was grief. Grief for the parts of myself I had abandoned. The dreams I had shelved. The words I never said. The truths I twisted to fit in. That grief was heavy. It came with tears and late-night journaling and some brutally honest conversations, mostly with myself. But it also came with relief. Because grief, as painful as it is, means you've started to care. It means you're acknowledging that something mattered, that you mattered. And in that space, between the grief and the relief, I began to find something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive kind that says everything will be fine, but the grounded kind that says, this pain has a purpose. I started thinking of anxiety not as a disorder, but as a disconnection. A signal that the life I was living no longer reflected the person I was becoming. And instead of seeing it as something to fix, I began treating it as something to follow. Not blindly, but respectfully. That didn't mean I stopped being afraid. If anything, paying attention made me even more aware of the fear, but also of its source. And fear, when you trace it all the way down, usually leads to something sacred. The parts of you that are still alive and fighting for expression. That's when I began to change my approach completely. I stopped asking, how do I get rid of this anxiety? And started asking, what part of me is trying to speak? That one shift, that single question, turned everything around. Because suddenly, anxiety wasn't the enemy. It was a doorway, a messenger, a mirror. And even though stepping through that doorway meant facing a lot of uncomfortable truths, it also meant stepping toward wholeness. I won't pretend the process was graceful. Some days felt like breaking down more than breaking through. But those were the days I grew the most. Not because I had answers, but because I stopped pretending I didn't have questions. And that's what healing really is, I think, not becoming someone new, but remembering who you are beneath all the roles and fears and stories. When you treat anxiety as a message instead of a mistake, you begin to hear your life differently. You start noticing where you've been living out of alignment. Not just in the big decisions, but in the tiny compromises that chip away at your soul. And little by little, you begin coming home to yourself. It's not quick, it's not clean, but it's honest. And honesty, real, soul-deep honesty, is where the healing begins. The funny thing about waking up is that once you start, you can't go back to sleep. Not really. You might try. You might even long for the simplicity of ignorance, the ease of not knowing. But once you've seen yourself clearly, even just for a moment, you can't unsee. And that's both the gift and the burden of self-awareness. It was around this time that I found myself drawn to Jung's deeper teachings. I'd always known him as the shadow guy, the psychologist who talked about the unconscious, archetypes, and dreams. But what resonated most wasn't the theory. It was the way he spoke of life's demands not as obstacles, but as sacred tasks. He believed we each carry certain responsibilities, not just to survive, but to become whole. Not in a moralistic sense, but in a soulful one. To live in alignment with what he called the self. That deeper truth within us that's often buried beneath layers of fear, shame, and conditioning. The idea that neurosis wasn't a malfunction, but a sign that we've strayed from our own path. That hit me like a lightning bolt. I started asking myself different questions. Not what's wrong with me, but what am I avoiding? Not why am I broken, but what truth am I afraid to live? Jung named several core tasks that every person must eventually face, becoming independent from our parents, not just physically, but psychologically, finding our own sense of purpose, giving back to something larger than ourselves, and finally coming to terms with death, not just as an end, but as a teacher. I'll be honest, that last one shook me. Death had always been this abstract concept, something far off, irrelevant to my day-to-day worries. But once I started doing this work, it became clear the fear of death was hiding in all kinds of places. In my reluctance to speak my truth, in my obsession with control, in my anxiety over time slipping by. And I realized I wasn't just afraid of dying. I was afraid of not living. That fear showed up in the smallest things. Hesitating to send that message, not signing up for the class I've been curious about, staying in conversations that drained me because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. It was a kind of slow, quiet death, the death of possibility. Jung believed that when we resist these core tasks, when we cling to comfort or conformity, life doesn't punish us. It reflects us. It shows us through symptoms and struggles where we've stopped growing. And for me, anxiety was that mirror. It wasn't punishing me. It was showing me where I had become too small for my own soul. I started thinking of these tasks not as pressure, but as invitations. Not, you have to grow, but you get to... And that small reframe changed everything. Because suddenly, anxiety wasn't just a problem to fix. It was a map, a compass pointing toward the work I needed to do, the conversations I needed to have, the risks I needed to take, the parts of myself I needed to reclaim. It didn't make the fear go away, but it gave the fear context. And with context comes courage. One of the hardest but most liberating moments came when I finally acknowledged how much of my identity had been shaped by other people's expectations. The way I presented myself, the way I measured success, even the way I loved. It was like peeling off layers of clothing I didn't realize I was wearing. Some of it had been with me so long, it felt like skin. But underneath, raw, real, unsure, there I was. And maybe for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to apologize for it. There's a kind of peace that comes from no longer needing to justify who you are. It's not arrogance, it's relief. The relief of no longer fighting yourself. Jung wrote that we don't become enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. And that's what these tasks really are, ways to walk into our own darkness. Not to be swallowed by it, but to integrate it, to learn from it, to carry it with wisdom instead of fear. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking how to get back to normal. I realized that normal was never the goal. Wholeness was. And wholeness includes the parts of you that are messy, afraid, uncertain, not just the polished ones. It's a slow unfolding, this path. One that asks more of you the deeper you go, but also gives more. More clarity, more connection, more life. And as I kept walking, I started to see maybe anxiety wasn't a sign that I was broken. Maybe it was a sign that I was finally waking up to the life I was meant to live. There's this moment Maybe you felt it too, when the weight inside you becomes too heavy to carry the same way anymore. It doesn't necessarily scream. Sometimes it just sighs, quietly, consistently, until one day you realize you're no longer carrying a life, you're dragging it. That was me, and it took a toll, not just emotionally, but physically. My body became a reflection of everything I hadn't dealt with. The tension in my shoulders, the fatigue I couldn't shake, the shallow breath I didn't notice until it caught. I used to think it was just stress, but now I know it was resistance. The kind you feel when you live out of alignment with your truth. It's like trying to walk upstream every single day and wondering why you're so tired all the time. Jung called it regression, this turning inward, not to heal but to escape. A slow slipping into older, safer versions of ourselves when life's demands feel too big. I began to see how I'd done exactly that, not out of weakness, but out of survival. When I couldn't face the truth, I avoided it. When I didn't know how to change, I numbed. I distracted myself with tasks, overthinking, endless content. I filled every moment to avoid the silence. Because in the silence, I could hear the truth, and the truth scared me. I wasn't living my life. I was managing it. And the cost? Constant anxiety, compulsions, this gnawing sense that time was passing and I wasn't really in it, that something essential was slipping through my fingers. Jung saw this kind of regression as the root of neurosis, when we abandon the path of growth and retreat into outdated ways of coping. And suddenly, my symptoms made sense. The looped thoughts, the irrational fears, the craving for control. They were all signs that my psyche was trying to protect itself from a life it no longer knew how to live. It was painful to admit, but also freeing, because once you name a pattern, you loosen its grip. I started noticing when I'd retreat, when I'd go silent instead of speaking up, when I'd fall back into perfectionism instead of allowing myself to be real, when I'd bury myself in distractions rather than face the stillness. And each time, I tried something different, not drastic, just honest. Instead of numbing, I'd journal. Instead of overthinking, I'd walk. Instead of isolating, I'd reach out, not to be fixed, just to be heard. These small acts became a kind of reclaiming, not of control, but of presence, of life. But it wasn't easy. Regression has a seductive pull. It offers safety, familiarity, the illusion of comfort. Growth, on the other hand, is uncomfortable by design. It asks you to choose truth over ease, presence over protection. And sometimes I failed. I'd fall back into old patterns and feel ashamed. But here's what I've learned. The shame only deepens the cycle. What breaks it is compassion. Compassion doesn't excuse the pattern. It understands it. And in that understanding, it creates space for something new. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, where I looked in the mirror and saw how tired I looked. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The kind that comes from carrying parts of yourself that no longer belong to you. I took a breath, put my hand on my chest, and whispered, "It's okay. You're learning. You're trying. That counts." It felt small, but it shifted something, because in that moment, I wasn't demanding that I be fixed. I was meeting myself where I was. And from that place, not judgment, but gentleness, I began to move forward again. Regression still visits me, especially on hard days. But now I recognize it for what it is, a sign that I'm at an edge, that I'm being invited to grow again. And growth, I've learned, isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. Sometimes we return to the same place, not because we've failed, but because we're ready to see it differently, to meet it with more courage, more awareness, more love. And that, I think, is the beginning of real healing. Taking responsibility for your life isn't a single, heroic act. It's a quiet daily choice. And for me, it started with the smallest realization. No one was coming to save me from myself. It sounds dramatic, but it was humbling. Up until that point, a part of me believed that someone, a mentor, a partner, a therapist, the universe, would step in and make things make sense. Fix the dissonance, clear the fog, rescue me from the weight of my own avoidance. But what I eventually had to face was this. The only person who could truly meet me in my mess was me. That was both terrifying and liberating. What Jung said about neurosis, that it's often the refusal to take responsibility for one's own problems, started to make a brutal kind of sense. I wasn't just anxious because of circumstances or genetics. I was anxious because I was avoiding ownership. I was outsourcing my power to people, to systems, to the past. I kept pointing outward. But the moment I turned that gaze inward, I realized how much of my own life I had been avoiding. There's a strange kind of relief in admitting, yes, this is mine. Not in a self-punishing way. Not, this is my fault. But this is my territory. I'm the one who has to tend it. And that's where the shift began. I started seeing my reactions differently. When I got triggered, instead of blaming the situation or retreating into silence, I began to ask, what's being touched in me? Where does this come from? And more importantly, what is this moment asking me to take responsibility for? Sometimes the answer was simple: to speak up, to set a boundary, to rest. Other times it was deeper: to stop expecting others to validate my worth, to release resentment I was still carrying, to acknowledge my own role in patterns I had outgrown but never questioned. It wasn't always pretty. In fact, some of the most powerful realizations were also the most painful. I had to admit I stayed in certain friendships not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being misunderstood. I had to see how often I'd chosen the comfort of victimhood over the discomfort of agency. How I'd let life is hard become an excuse to stay small. And let me be honest, some days I still do. But now, when I catch myself slipping into that old narrative, the one where everything is happening to me, I pause. I breathe. I remind myself that growth is not about perfection. It's about presence, about the willingness to stay in the room with your own discomfort long enough to understand it. Jung spoke about the moral effort it takes to truly become oneself. That phrase, moral effort, stayed with me, because he wasn't talking about morality in the sense of being good or righteous. He meant the courage to face your own limitations, your own fears, your own resistance, without flinching, to stop deceiving yourself, to stop hiding behind distractions or justifications. That kind of honesty takes strength, but more than that, it takes kindness. The kind of kindness that holds you accountable without shame. That says, yes, you made mistakes, but you're still worthy of showing up. You're still worthy of changing. And I think that's what true responsibility is. It's not about blame. It's about power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that liberates. There was a night, quiet, ordinary, when I sat on the floor of my apartment and wrote down everything I was avoiding. Conversations, decisions, dreams. And one by one, I looked at them and said, I see you. I'm not running anymore. It was a turning point. Not because everything changed overnight, but because I did. I stopped waiting. I started choosing. Not just once. Every day. Even when it's hard. Even when I fall short. Because the truth is, responsibility doesn't mean you get it right all the time. It means you stop pretending someone else will live your life for you. And when you make that choice, even once, you start to rebuild a kind of inner trust. You begin to believe in your own capacity to handle life. Not because it's easy, but because it's yours. That belief, I've found, is stronger than fear, stronger than shame, stronger than anxiety. It doesn't silence the noise entirely, but it gives you something solid to stand on when the waves come. And they will come. But now, when they do, I don't get swept away so easily, because I know whose life I'm standing in. Meaning, there's a quiet kind of revolution that happens when you stop running, not from the world, but from yourself. And when that running stops, something beautiful begins, a return. Not to the person you used to be, but to the one you were always becoming underneath it all. That's where I found myself. After the noise, the unraveling, the grief, the work, there came a stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of presence. Of finally sitting with myself and not feeling the urge to flinch or fix. Just being there, with everything I had once tried to outrun. It was the first time I felt like I was truly home, and not because anything external had changed, but because I had stopped seeing anxiety as the enemy and started recognizing it as a teacher. One I never asked for, but one who had led me back to a truth I had forgotten. That I'm not a problem to be solved. That my pain is not a weakness. That my sensitivity is not a flaw. That my longing for meaning, for honesty, for peace is not naive, but sacred. Jung spoke often of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the fragmented parts of ourselves into something true and real. And while it sounds abstract, I began to see what it looked like in daily life. It looked like speaking up when I used to stay silent. It looked like resting without guilt. It looked like forgiving myself for not knowing what I didn't know. It looked like letting go of who I thought I had to be in order to love who I actually am. And slowly, things softened. The panic that once lived just beneath my skin eased. The racing thoughts quieted. Not because they vanished, but because I no longer believed every one of them. I had created space, not to control everything, but to meet it with awareness, with breath. That's the secret no one tells you. The healing doesn't always feel like fireworks or breakthroughs. Sometimes it feels like waking up and realizing you're no longer afraid to feel. To sit with what is without rushing to change it. To trust that you are not fragile for having wounds. You are strong because you're willing to tend them. I began reconnecting with parts of myself I hadn't touched in years. My curiosity, my creativity, my joy, not in grand gestures, but in small moments, a walk without headphones, laughter that caught me off guard, the quiet pleasure of doing something just because it made my heart feel full. And that's when I understood what Jung meant by shadow integration. Not that you vanquish your darkness, but that you turn toward it, hand extended, and say, I see you. You belong too. There's a kind of freedom that comes from no longer being at war with yourself. And in that freedom, something else awakens, compassion. Not just for yourself, but for others. For the people still stuck in loops. For the ones numbing their pain because they don't know another way. For the ones performing strength because they've never been taught it's okay to fall apart. You begin to realize that behind every mask is a story. Behind every defense is a wound. And behind every difficult person is a person who has been hurt. This doesn't make everything easier, but it makes it more human, more connected, more real. And maybe that's the real healing. Not escaping the mess, but loving through it. Not fixing everything, but choosing to stay awake even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. So if you walk this path, or are still walking it, I just want to say, I see you. I honor the work you're doing, even when no one claps for it. Especially then, because the most powerful transformations happen in the dark, away from applause. They happen in quiet acts of truth, in brave acts of honesty, in showing up. And maybe, just maybe, the anxiety you carry isn't a curse. Maybe it's a call, not to fight harder, but to soften. Not to push more, but to listen, to feel, to return, to yourself. If this felt meaningful to you, it might mean something to someone else too. So hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. That's how YouTube knows to share it with others. Maybe together, we can help someone see things a little differently.